Well, here's another game that was recommended to me by friends that I should check out, so I did. Sunset Riders is a neat little Wild West style action game where you're tasked with hunting down a few criminals for their bounties. That seems pretty straightforward, right? Well, it is, but that's why it's actually pretty fun. First, let's talk about the introductory scenes. They're done in an anime style, which was a bit different for the time. I mean, it's not incredibly flashy or anything, but it does a job of introducing the characters. There's not too much of a difference between them, other than the weapon that they use. It seems that two of them, Steve and Billy, use the same single-shot weapon, whereas Cormano and Bob use a spread-shot weapon. There might be other differences that I haven't noticed, but it seems that if there are unique traits between the four, they're minute. So let's move on to the actual gameplay. As I said, it's fairly simple. At the start, you choose one of the four riders, and then you go on a spree taking out different gangs of enemies. The controls are very simple. You press B to jump, Y to shoot, and A to slide. I'll be honest, sliding doesn't really do much. It can be used as an effective evade tactic only if you can time it right, but usually when you do need to use it, there'll be more bullets surrounding you, so you're screwed anyway. Maybe it's just my reflexes though. In any case, sliding isn't entirely useful, so you'll probably just be focused on jumping and shooting, which is what you should be concentrating on anyway. Basically, whatever enemy you see, you shoot. Only bullets will damage you, so you won't be penalized for simply touching an enemy. However, if you get that close, you won't be able to see enemy rounds coming, so you're as good as dead anyway. Oh, and there's no health bar, so if you take damage, you're losing a life. So in order to avoid any unnecessary loss of this life, it's best to try taking out your enemies as you approach them on the screen. This is easy to do in the beginning of the game, but of course later on it starts to get a bit more complicated. In fact, this complication starts in the second level, where you're actually riding on horseback. There's a wagon in front of you, throwing barrels at you to trip up your horse. In the meantime, other riders are approaching you and shooting, and because of the small space that you can actually move in, it can be hard to actually evade those shots. The wagon goes away a short time later, and the stage gets considerably easier as a result, as you're just forced to shoot down a few things in an approaching train. For the most part, the stages themselves aren't that difficult, other than a few select spots, like the stagecoach part I just mentioned. The bosses, on the other hand, can be a real frustrating part of the game. The boss characters can take a lot of damage before falling, and to add into the confusion, a bunch of lower thugs approach you as well. You can opt to kill the minions, or you can just focus on the boss. I'd recommend shooting the little thugs because although it drags out the fight a bit, there'll be less enemy bullets on the screen. Plus, a large barrage of the thugs do stop, as there is a limited amount of the criminals that will come to the boss's aid. Once you see the ambush stop, you can start with the now easier boss. Now, not all of the bosses have minions coming after you. Right after you fight the horseback boss, you'll enter a bar to fight two guys throwing dynamite at you. And that's the whole stage. No one else comes to their aid, but since there's two of them, it makes for an intense fight. Here's my biggest problem with the game. Your character moves way too slowly. Instead of running through the stage shooting all the bandits, instead, you're forced to walk at a leisurely pace. This is what makes dodging bullets a bit more of a chore than it should be. Thankfully, you can jump extremely high, so you have that going for you. There are some power-ups that can be found in the game. Many of them are dropped from killed bandits, and yet some of them are just sitting around waiting for you to grab them. There's another method of finding power-ups as well. You can enter some of the bars, and when you come out, a power-up will have appeared. You can also time this to evade enemy shots, but I don't find it as effective as flat-out dodging them. The power-ups differ in usefulness. Some of them will just give you extra points, and others will upgrade your weapons. Then of course you get your standard extra life. But that's about all of them that I was able to find, and if you die, you lose your weapon upgrade. Although your sound effects are pretty standard for SNES, there are small voiceovers that are played when fighting and defeating the bosses. They're a bit muffled, but still sound pretty damn good for the time that Sunset Riders was released. Finally, we move on to the graphics. They actually do a very good job in portraying the western environment of the game. The whole game has a dusty feel to it, if that makes any sense. All of the bandits look the part, and the game gets bonus points since there's good animations for all of the enemies and their respective deaths. There's also a good amount of detail involved in the game. If I had one complaint though, it's the explosions. They feel a bit out of place, since it's a giant pixelated explosion instead of the cartoonish one that most games were using at the time. Granted, it's still pretty awesome to see at first, but when you look at it afterwards, it just seems a bit off. This also reminds me that the explosion hitboxes can be difficult to judge, especially on the stage with the two bosses in the bar. You might find yourself dying even though you thought that you were outside the dynamite kill zone. It's also hard to figure out because the explosions take up half the screen. Unfortunately, I can't show you this feature yet, but Sunset Riders does have a 2-player co-op mode. I've been told that the game is much easier with it, but until I can get with a friend and check it out, I have to settle with the solo play. Sunset Riders is a fun game, but it starts to get a bit too frustrating near the end. In fact, I can't get past the Native American boss, who blocks most of your shots and throws knives at you faster than you can dodge them. You also don't get long enough of an invulnerability protection time, so you can't even get away from the boss before he attacks you again. It's a shame too, because I was really enjoying it. Anyway, if you like old school action games, give this one a shot. It's not as hard as the Contra games, but it'll still give you a run for your money. Final score? 9 out of 10. This is Reaper. Happy fragging.